But the planning stage is really a point where you've got your strategy, you're understanding where you're looking to get to from a top level perspective. Really, it's about then planning your organizational alignment, looking to really create an actual migration plan across skills, across rationalizing your additional estate. So organization alignment is really it's two parts of the cloud adoption framework. It really advises having two teams. You have your cloud adoption team and your cloud governance team. And essentially, it's about putting those two teams together of different stakeholders who will basically make your plan happen. And that is across, and the way to look at it is your cloud adoption team is really your technical elements, and your cloud governance team is essentially the rest of the business, but more likely to be sort of your senior leadership. And really the key thing is what we're trying to do as part of the framework, and what the framework will help you with, is creating a balance between the two. So moving quickly, in terms of most technical people want to move things as quickly as possible, and obviously dive into the technology as quickly as they can, whereas the other side is really controlling and reducing risks to the organization, so putting accountability in for adoption and governance. So the cloud adoption team is really your IT department that's going to be executing the cloud adoption tasks, and the governance team is really those that are going to be putting in the processes and the controls, so enabling to work in a secure and efficient framework and environment to make sure that the risk is reduced as much as possible for the organization. But the key thing is how those two teams interact with one another is the sort of minimal viable product for aligning the organization to be prepared for an Azure migration. And obviously, as you adopt cloud further, these teams should evolve, and the processes as part of these teams and how they work together should evolve at the same time. But the key message here is really to make sure that those guide rails are in place to ensure that what we're trying to achieve is achieved through the sort of wood for trees type scenario of technology. So rationalizing your digital estate. So what options do we have? So a key part of the cloud adoption framework is most people probably would have come across the 5 R's, but the first step as part of the planning phase is really just to take it again at a higher level and just say, okay, well, what elements can we rehost? What can we move as is into Azure? And what things do we need to refactor? What things do we need to either modernize or change to be able to move those into Azure from a platform as a service perspective? And obviously there'll be higher priorities depending on those particular workloads. So for example, an application that's used on a very infrequent basis that isn't a core component of the way the business operates is likely to be potentially a rehost scenario where we move as is, whereas something that's business critical that is not performing as intended at the moment, or has a short shelf life, is something that we're looking to probably refactor. And then retire essentially is those that we want to basically say, okay, we'll look at something else, we'll do something else there. We'll completely look at producing something else and designing something else within Azure that does the same thing. So this is a very high level, and what we're basically saying here is that we should have a list of the various workloads that you have on your digital estate, and then you should be really looking to put those into those three brackets. What are you looking to move as is? What needs to be modified, and what can we retire and either just save because we're not having to repurpose it within Azure, or those that we can potentially repurpose. Skills readiness. So it's a key part of the planning phase. So skills readiness, basically what it says is what it's on the tin. So obviously it's a shift in technology, it's a shift in processes, it's a shift in methodologies. The key thing is that we need to really identify where we have skills gaps. So where can we basically give training and give guidance to our teams to be able to be ready for the migration. Obviously, the key thing there is to then look across those teams. What's missing? What can we do to help them? And then potentially establish new teams. So if we have to build a new dev team, whether we have to potentially migrate an infrastructure team to more of a strategic-based team, then those are the types of things that we need to think about in terms of building out that skills readiness plan. And this is where as well you start to think about whether you need partners to help you with this Azure migration. It might be that you do your identification of gap and your gap analysis, and you might find that actually realistically, to keep the lights on, we're not going to be able to give any resources to this particular migration project, and the only resources we can give are the more strategic top level side of things. So really we need to engage with a partner or Microsoft directly to be able to roll this particular transformation out. But the other key thing to think about is around bringing those teams on that journey. So the upskilling side of things, obviously by moving as much of your workload into a PaaS-based service, it negates the need for more of those infrastructure type tasks. So being able to then reallocate those resources and upskill your teams and make them feel more engaged with your organization is a key thing and a key part of this. But really what we're trying to do there is build out a plan in terms of what do we need to do to be ready? How can we incorporate other resources that are not just within our organization? And then what does it look like on a long-term basis, being able to upskill and ensure that we've got the right infrastructure and the right organizational structure in place to be able to manage and succeed within Azure itself. And then finally, the cloud adoption plan. So all of these elements that we've spoken about, really we want to translate this into strategy and effort into an actionable plan. So the prerequisites are essentially the non-negotiables. These are things that we have to do. So we have to confirm our strategic justifications, so our motivations, our outcomes, and any inputs that we need to do. So whether we need to rationalize our digital estate, our skills readiness, those types of elements. Then the key thing is to define and prioritize workloads. So Microsoft, as part of the Cath framework, will always say you should prioritize your first 10 workloads to establish an initial, basically an adoption backlog. Really, again, to make sure that you're comfortable. It's not a basically do everything in one fast movement approach. It's more about making sure that we get things right. So the key thing there is to then prioritize those workloads. Aligning assets is essentially identifying which assets are required to support those prioritized workloads. And then defining your iterations and releases is just giving those time blocks of resources to actually do the work, but also being able to change processes. So your change management processes, changing your production processes allows the organization to catch up with that technology change. So really it's key there to define your iterations and your releases, and then estimate your timescales as part of that plan. Establish those rough timelines again, so the business gets a heads up on terms of what's coming down the track and what different departments and what different elements are needed to be able to fulfill this cloud adoption plan. So that's the planning stage. We should be at a point now where we have that cloud adoption plan in place. We have those 10 priority workloads, and really we're looking at the ready phase where we're readying our Azure environment to migrate those workloads to Azure. So a key factor again of the framework is the ready phase, and this is where we're looking to set up Azure, map out your first landing zone, and then really make sure we've made all the relevant considerations as part of that first landing zone. So in terms of setup, for those that are already familiar with Azure, this might be quite basic for you, but for those that are relatively new, then this is something that's really core to understanding how you make those first steps. And there is that setup guide link there within the Cath framework material that will help. But basically what we need to do is we need to really think about these 5 stages to building out your initial Azure tenant. So really what we want to do is we want to start with organizing our resources. So setting up a management hierarchy. This basically applies to things like access control, policies and compliance of group resources, using tagging, for example, to track related resources. Then moving on to managing access. So your RBAC, your role-based access controls, making sure that users only have the permissions that they need. Managing cost and billing, again, really crucial with Azure being a consumption type model. So it's identifying your subscription type, understanding how your billing works, and see how you can control costs. And this can even be a very top level in the sense of how do you actually bill Azure as a from a top level? Are you going to do pay as you go directly with Microsoft? Are you going to do a CSP model with a partner and leverage the benefits of CSP? Are you an enterprise that might benefit from an EA agreement? Those are types of things that we need to think about as part of this phase, but also being able to tag the different resources within those resource groups to be able to allocate costs and billing to various departments, for example. So a lot of customers that we engage with, they would like to be able to show what departments are costing what within Azure. Planning for governance, security and compliance. So enforcing policies, for example, and enforcing security settings and compliance settings. Again, keeping you legal and keeping you compliant from a market regulation perspective if you're in regulated markets. Monitoring and reporting. So again, get visibility across resources, helping you fix problems, optimize your performance, and get insight into any behavior, whether that's your users or your end customers. And then staying current with Azure is really around taking a proactive approach to change management and making sure you're continuously innovating within, and you've got the parameters to be able to innovate. So whether that's having a production environment with a test and dev environment or a sandbox environment, again, all things that you need to think about as part of your initial setup. And on the right hand side there, you've got a basic overview of the various hierarchies of an Azure tenant. So your management groups, your subscriptions under that, your resource groups, and then the resources that make up those resource groups. Landing zones and Cath foundation. So this is a real key element to understanding one, landing zones, and two, how following the Cath framework and following the different elements to it and making sure your planning is correct is really crucial to the optimization of your Azure environment. Landing zones are essentially the structure around your resources that allow those resources to access core Azure utilities that support best practice. And what that essentially means is that the Cath foundation is a foundation of the core Azure utilities in the sense of tooling, in the sense of processes, in the sense of setup. So whether you use Azure Security Center, for example, whether you use Azure Monitor, for example, the beauty behind it is that if you have that Cath foundation in place, all of your resources as part of each landing zone will automatically fold back to that Cath foundation. So everything will operate in the same way. We build our Cath foundations as infrastructure as code, and that's a completely different webinar that we can obviously send you to. But the key thing there is it's your centralized controls. So it makes sure all of your workloads operate in the same way across each landing zone. So whether that's performance, whether that's security, whether that's particular governance, whether that's how you operate. And we'll move on to some of the key things there as examples in a second. But the reality is it's about making sure that your Azure environment works in a consistent way across all of its resources. So on the right-hand side, you can see that you've got the base layer foundation, which is all your foundation tooling and processes as part of your Azure environment. Then you have your landing zones underneath that. And then you have the makeup of those landing zones in terms of what resources make up those landing zones. So some of the examples that we have here with regards to the Cath foundation are really important. So security and governance, for example, you want consistent security and governance across all of your resources. So this can be across, access control, identity and authentication, network security groups, for example. And some of the value examples that resource can only be created in certain regions to meet company data compliance. We've had various scenarios where somebody in our customer has been able to create Azure resources in a particular region that doesn't fit the organization's data policy. They've spun up some servers within, or some VMs, sorry, within the US, for example, because that region is slightly cheaper than the UK region, for example. But unfortunately, that hasn't fitted in with the company's data policy. They've got data held or withheld in the US now, and just having some governance there to say these can't be created or regions can't be used that are outside a selected list of regions for data sovereignty perspective. Another key example is data is encrypted in transit at all times. So that basically is a core foundation to say any resources that we spin up, anything that we use within Azure, data is always encrypted in transit. From a cost management perspective, again, it's about enforcing spending budgets, for example, stopping certain resources being created. So a key example here that we hear often about is someone spinning up a resource in a test or dev environment and completely forgetting about it. And obviously Azure is on a consumption-based operating model from a cost perspective. We get a phone call to say 2 months later we've got a bill of £3,000 that we don't know anything about. That's because somebody spun something up and forgot to deprovision it. Key thing here is putting rules enforcing that anything that's idle for a period of time is automatically deprovisioned, or at least you're warned about that happening. Team members being unaware of budget, for example. Putting a budget in place within your Azure environment is a surefire way of making sure that you don't have any unsuspecting costs. And then it also stops, obviously, resources deployed and configured in error coming back to bite you from a costing perspective. Those elements, and in terms of policies and alerting, will be in place to say, hey, this is configured in error, or this shouldn't have been deployed, do something about it. From an operations perspective, this is again around sort of tagging, so making sure we can identify monitoring elements. And again, the beauty behind this is any additional resources that are deployed, whether that's within an existing landing zone or a new landing zone, are automatically taking those policies and tagging rights and rulings from the Cath Foundation, so you don't have to, one, manually do it, but two, it's all in line and in keeping with how you would like to work. And then performance management, so resource utilization, things like scaling rules that are set within the actual landing zone itself to make sure that you can identify over-resourced workloads to save yourself some money, but also setting scaling limits so you avoid large cost where you might have a huge demand for a particular resource. Azure naturally scales to meet that demand. You might want to set limits to that so you don't get a huge bill and get in trouble with the finance director because it's scaled to an extent that's become unaffordable. These are all elements that you can put in that top level foundation that all of your resources basically work from, and follows the same set of policies and procedures. Just as an example of this in action, this is a hub and spoke network topology example. So on the left hand side here, I'll use my mouse, we have what we would classify as the foundation, so the Cath Foundation, where you've got sort of your core Azure utilities in terms of your monitoring tools, security center, key vaults, log analytics, for example. You've got your identity and access management and your network management. And then on the right hand side, you've got your landing zone. So you have your production environment, your DR environment, and your test and dev environment. But the key thing is that all of these relate back to what's provisioned in the foundation itself, obviously to get that consistency across security, cost, and performance.